So this week, our readings aim at giving us a little bit of a picture of 21st century America. This semester will lead us through a great deal of history from a variety of perspectives. The next 3 weeks after this one will be spent with significant subgroups on the American religious scene. We'll follow Native America, Judaism, and Catholicism, each for 1 week, before we turn to the Protestant world, those Protestant traditions which have really characterized the majority, the religious majority in the United States throughout the nation's history. So we'll see that the Protestant world is not singular, it's not unified, it's not a monolithic organization. It is very diverse within itself internally. It's got a great deal of internal variation that has developed through history for a number of reasons, according to a number of social issues which traditions have faced. New forms of Protestant Christianity have developed in the context of the United States and in constant relationship with the social and political context. So near the end of the semester, we'll also take some time to look at the more or less so-called Eastern traditions, especially both Buddhism and Islam, that have become more of an influential presence in America and more of a real option for or presence in the consciousness of American citizens in, around the mid-20th century. So we will take a look at that. But for this week, through the 2 posted readings, we'll take a look, we'll take a minute just to step back and to look at the world around us. And part of what I mean by that is that we'll step back from any assumptions we might have about religion, about what religion is and how Americans are or are not religious. We'll take just a minute to look at today's America, at 21st century America. And part of what we'll focus on, especially through Bacevich, whom you read, will look more like politics or even entertainment to many of you. But as Prothero tells us, it's just not that easy to separate religion from politics in the American context. It never has been, and I love this line from Prothero. He says, "Ever since George Washington put his hand on a Bible and swore to uphold a godless constitution, the U.S. has been both staunchly secular and resolutely religious. Religion and politics they were bedfellows from the start." That's what he says. It's complicated, right? I mean, God does not appear in the U.S. Constitution. The word God does not appear in the U.S. Constitution, and that's what he means by godless constitution. It is a document that did not set itself to a theological program of any sort. So since that moment when the hand went on the Bible to swear allegiance to a godless constitution, it's just really well put. It's complicated. So for me, and our approach throughout the semester, taking a functional view or a functionalist view just makes the most sense. Looking at traditional definitions and traditional understandings of what constitutes and what happens in a church, temple, or mosque, for instance, that remains helpful. What constitutes religion and how it's expressed, looking at the traditional formulations of that, it remains helpful, and it is good for us to do insofar as it is helpful, as it remains useful. But we'll also want to keep our eyes on, open throughout, as we're attending to specifically religious manifestations of belief and behavior and belonging. We want to keep our eyes open for ritual, for shared values, for generally accepted creeds, for statements of national purpose, and for dissent, for those moments when individuals or groups challenge an aspect of American social or political reality on grounds of meaning or value, or the failure of a nation to live up to or in accordance with its stated values, right? You can think Kaepernick or Malcolm X, but you also want to think about folks like, we'll dig deep, right? We'll think about folks also like bottom right, Edward Shemp, whom we'll get to know in just a second. But these aren't things that we usually think about, right? Shared meaning, value, purpose, national ritual or creed, right? These categories aren't something that we're trained to see as we look at the world around us, at our national environment. So Prothero writes this book. It's from 2007. You read the first chapter, and it's called Religious Literacy, right? And it's really a certain angle on American history. It is in some ways a book of American history with a specific thesis. And throughout the book, which I will recommend to you if you're interested, though we will only read this first chapter, this book is a good read. But throughout it, he weaves together the story of religion, education, politics, power, and diversity to explain how it is that we got to the cultural place that's described in this first chapter, right, which you read. How we got here, right? For a nation that's so easily riled up about religion or, riled up on religious grounds, how did we get to be so very religiously illiterate? Overwhelmingly, Americans just don't know much about religion. Like, a minority can name the 4 Gospels of the Christian New Testament upon which many think this nation was founded, though that it wasn't in any simple or direct way, right? But we just don't know these things, right? So how is it that religion can be so centrally important to the hot button issues of our political reality, of our social reality, that we can argue about it, that can be something that can define like who you vote for or what issues or policies you vote for, and it can therefore shape your experience whether or not you were, voted for it or not. And yet we just don't know and haven't felt the need as a culture to learn much about it, right? So that's the question he asks. How did we get to be, as he says in the title of this chapter that you read, how did we get to be a nation of religious illiterates, right? That's the narrative of this book, which, again, I recommend to you. We won't read any more of this book in this class, but the history we trace will tap back into the story he tells at various points throughout the semester. I will refer to it. But as we start the semester and as we prepare to learn about religion in America, it's good, again, to take a minute to reflect on where we're starting from, right? So I hope you took the religious literacy quiz that appears in that chapter. It's kind of entertaining, right? And it's worth taking a minute to reflect on how you did on that quiz, right? You're working on your genogram assignment right now, and you're thinking about your own family's relationship to religion and, religious experience. And you can ask yourself, along with Prothero here, how did your early education impact your knowledge of religions? Your own or others, or if you don't have one, that of your neighbors, of your community members. How did your early schooling and values shape how you learned about religion, right? How you approach these mythic truths, these religious facts, right? Prothero concludes, and my own experience as a teacher, as a student, as a parent, as a community member really supports this, right? That he concludes that, quote, students are learning almost nothing about the Bible in high school, right? And it's true, right? And for some of you, that may not have been the case, and I have had students anecdotally express to me that, like, actually, we had an entire class on the Bible. And if you are one of those students, you should know that that's rare and pretty awesome from my perspective as a religious studies scholar. But it really is a fair question to ask, right? So what? Who cares? Is this a problem that students don't learn anything about the Bible in high school, right? American high school students also learn almost nothing about, like, blind mole rats, or, how to bake bread, or how to change a tire, but nobody gets worked up about that, right? You don't see people getting up in arms about that, right? So who cares about religion, and should we, and why should we? Well, Prothero closes this chapter with a pretty compelling anecdote from a case heard by the Colorado Supreme Court. And the moral, as he tells us, is that if jurors are going to quote the Bible, and they seem to, then they should at least have the decency and the piety to get the Bible right, which is like a really, at one and the same time, both snarky and also just pragmatically true. Because in America, jurors do quote the Bible. They do refer to it, as do judges, as do congresspeople, presidents, campaigns at every level. Bottom left, extra bonus points for anyone who can say who is the woman who is standing next to and holding the Bible for now Governor Gavin Newsom, and what is she doing now? Anyway, religion, and especially biblical religion, does play a role in American political life, whether or not it's a substantial role or just an imagistic role for spectacular purposes is always something that people like to discuss and argue about, but it does play a role, and it seems to remain important to the American electorate that it continues to play a role, right? So it may be not just important, but even really crucial to the functioning of American democracy, to the functioning and the integrity of American democracy, that we learn something about it, that we learn something about the religious world, right? So why don't we? why don't we teach it, right? Why haven't most of us learned it? And that's kind of where Prothero is coming from with the chapter you read. Well, here's what I'll say. There is a kind of anxiety about teaching religion to children, to minors, an anxiety about teaching about religion in the public schools. And this anxiety stems from, I would say, a less than clear understanding of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? And here we have it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It opens with its two religion clauses, right? The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. It goes on to speech, press, peaceable assembly, and petitioning for redress. And you might take a minute to sort of consider and reflect on why it is that these 5 basic fundamental rights are organized together. Why are they held together within the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? A recent Supreme Court nominee who did join the bench was asked exactly this question. Why is it that these 5 rights are contained together in the First Amendment? And notably, she had no answer and kind of a resistance to the question. But I think it's a valuable question. It's a good question. So you might ask it of yourself. But I would say that our resistance to teaching about religion in public schools comes from, number one, a less than clear understanding of this amendment. And I would suggest that it's also coupled with the perhaps untethered and maybe over-exuberant celebration of the individual rights and individual dignity that is at the center of the American myth. A consistent and concomitant resistance to the community-determined values that are seen to be or sort of feared as something that's oppressive, right? So like we resist the role of biblical traditions and religion generally within the rights of the individual to an education and free expression. That could be in its own class, and I apologize, that was a little jumbled, I think. I got a bit distracted. But really it's, why don't we teach it? Why? Because we're afraid of the First Amendment. So here is the First Amendment. Again, you take a minute to look at it, think about it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's been there since 1791, right? In 1963, the Supreme Court decision Abingdon v. Shemp, we met Edward Shemp earlier, right? He was a Unitarian Universalist who took this case to court because he was against his sons being required to hear and read Bible verses in a public school, right? He was a Unitarian Universalist, which is an offshoot. We'll learn about them a little later. Universalist, which means, sort of all spiritual traditions, all mythical realities are open for engagement, but does come from within a Christian tradition, and yet still, not clearly canonically, traditionally Christian. For instance, not Trinitarian, as most Christians are, with the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit, depending on your tradition, but Unitarian, right? God is singular and universal, right? So this fellow in 1963 took this case to the Supreme Court, says, I don't want the Bible in my kids' public school education, right? I don't think he should be forced into that. And so what this case determined is that public schools and school personnel may not mandate devotional activities in their schools or classrooms, right? We take this as a given now. This is taken as we assume this, right? As a public school educator, I, for instance, am not allowed, constitutionally barred from requiring of you any devotional activities. And it was argued at the time against this decision that the court effectively supported the religion of secularism, or made canonical or established non-religion, right? That if you're going to say you can't establish any religion, well, then you also can't establish secularism. So the argument went. Now, this is 1963, and it's important to note that 1958 was the high watermark of American religious affiliation, which is to say that in 1958, more Americans than at any other time said, yes, I affiliate with a church. That number has dropped precipitously since then. But at this time in history, in 63, we had, as a nation, Americans really did affiliate with churches. And, according to the model proposed by sociologist Will Herberg in the title to his now classic book, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, right? That's basically the diversity of America at this moment, but people did affiliate and they were religious. And so they saw this Abingdon v. Shemp decision as a little bit of a rejection of the possibility of religion and an institutionalization or establishment of secularism. So it was contentious at the time. In response, Justice Clark distinguished between the practice of religion and the study of religion, and strongly encouraged the study of religion. But it's sort of a fine line for folks who haven't been trained in religious studies, who aren't comfortable with the language of religious expression and rituals and creeds, and and so people back away from it, right? So the Supreme Court may say you are not allowed to do devotional activities. You can be brought before the courts for that. You can be prosecuted for that, right? You can lose your job. But please do still teach about religion. Turn that back on. Please, right now. Excuse me 1 second. Please go clean your room. Do not do that again. I apologize. So we understand how that could have played out. Now, fast forward a bit, right? That was 1963. Now we're in 1990 with the Board of Education of Westside Community School District v. Mergens, right? This is a new case that comes up. And this case ended up holding the decision held that religious groups must be granted equal access, right? That the same privileges as secular groups. So if your school, your public school, is allowed to have a chess club, if a chess club is allowed to meet on your school grounds, well, then you must allow a Bible study group to meet too, right? So you can't bar religious groups or devotional groups in the language of Abington v. Shemp. They might be devotional groups, and you might not be able to mandate that all the kids participate, but you also can't bar those activities. If you're going to allow secular activities, you must also allow extracurricular, religiously oriented devotional activities. See how that works? So the combined effect of these two cases, which are pretty substantial religious freedom cases in the courts, is that public schools cannot actively promote religious activities, but neither can they prohibit them, right? So the laws governing public education then, which kind of lead in some ways, or are connected in some ways to, how it is that our nation knows or does not know anything about religion, right? The laws governing public education follow the same pattern of dynamic interplay as we see here in the First Amendment, right? You can't push religion, but you also can't prohibit it. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't teach it, and it doesn't mean you can't learn it, but people are a little nervous, understandably, and so they keep their distance, right? Many of you probably heard early in life, like religion and politics, don't talk about them, not in polite company, right? And so when we're enculturated to believe that religion is this divisive thing that can potentially foment a kind of fragmented argumentative nature, then you can understand how teachers in a public school arena with 30 kids in a classroom, they don't want to step in that sticky thicket, But but it's possible that education is being compromised by that, because in the arena of religion, here's the thing: is we are talking about, when we enter the world of religion and religious studies, we are talking about ultimate truths, about absolute truths, many of which are incommensurable, right? They're not apples and oranges, right? They're just incommensurable. You can't compare them to one another. And often they're outright mutually exclusive. Like, we have to recognize that if you have a true and pious, devout religious belief, then there's a way in which, like, if you believe that your story is 100% true, there's a way in which you kind of have to believe that my story, if it's different and conflicts with yours, is wrong, right? So while people can and do learn to be sort of open-minded about the religious experience of others, there is a degree to which, if we're honest, religious commitment can create a sort of a context within which ultimate truths can't be accepted outside of that realm. Now, we will play back on this throughout the semester, and we will see the ways in which interreligious dialogue is actually not only completely possible, but recommended even for those of great faith. But, all of these religious truths, everything, when it's taken to be true, when religious truths are taken to be true, when they are held to be self-evident, they're really meant to change your life and shape your life in certain ways. That's kind of what religions aim at, whether they are church, temple, mosque religions, or whether they are extra-ecclesial religions, right? Anyway, this brings us back to the chapter's opening, to Prothero's opening, right? Is the polarized religious debate that Prothero describes part of your experience? Is a good question, right? Is there a middle ground? And if so, is it besieged? Are those who feel like they're moderate somehow being smashed in between two very extremist sides of things, the liberal secularist America and the conservative Christian America. The rhetoric of lament that he describes is not the rhetoric of this class. Just for the record, here we're going to be enlivened by the opportunity to follow and participate in this always energetic, always changing history. I'm going to reach behind me right now to get a quote that I just recalled. Excuse me. Here we go. So on page 42, Prothero says, in fact, interreligious dialogue assumes basic knowledge on both sides of the religious divide that the discussion is designed to bridge, right? Like, you actually do, interreligious dialogue assumes that you know something from the other side, that you've learned something, that you're not religiously illiterate, so that you can have a conversation that finds common ground, moves forward as a polity, whether or not you agree religiously, you recognize the political imperative to work together towards shared aims. So this book was written in 2007 in the post 9/11 Bush era, right? For those of you who remember that. Now, well over a decade later, the nation, pushing 2 decades later, the nation, well over a decade later, the nation remains divided, fractured, polarized, right? The divide between conservative Christians and secular progressives that Prothero opens with, it's not gone. It hasn't dissolved. It hasn't fizzled. It hasn't resolved itself. And there are plenty of folks who continue to feel keenly the perceived attacks from the other side, whichever side that is, right? Secular liberals fear that the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is going to, hamper their freedoms as individuals, sure that an entire generation of Americans will suffer under the tyrannical rule of an only thinly veiled biblical theocracy, right? That's the fear from secular progressives, that a conservative court is going to use the Bible as a weapon in order to limit human rights and secular freedoms, right? That's something that remains keenly felt by a good many secular progressives. Now, on the other side, conservative Christians see the changing laws around especially issues of gender, sex, marriage, drugs, as a catastrophic relaxation of the moral authority that's made this nation exceptional and providentially blessed and chosen by God. And there is an entire, rhetorical history of that, right? American exceptionalism is something that is rooted in a biblically valenced narrative, and Ronald Reagan made it especially popular once more with his Shining City on the Hill, which we will return to at a later date. But these folks, the conservative Christians, see the removal of the 10 Commandments from courthouses, for instance, as an erasure of the shared moral code without which the rule of law is meaningless and impotent, right? That they view defensively the desire of marginalized minority religious secular groups to not have their own public ritual calendar defined by a faith-based holiday they do not share, right? When somebody says, look, I don't want my ritual calendar defined by Christmas because, I don't know, for instance, I'm like not a Christian, right? Then the conservative Christian Americans, they feel defensive about that, right? That seems like an attack on the moral fiber that holds together and justifies the rule of law within the nation. So while it happens that I fall on what might be pigeonholed as the socially liberal side of most of these causes, right? That happens to be true. While I happen not to believe that we're anywhere near a war on Christmas, except maybe if that war is understood as a war waged by consumer capitalism against a holiday that is commemorating the birth of a communally minded, sacramentally oriented social justice warrior of yore. But that's really a theological point and also beside my point here. Anyway, while I happen to fall on the socially liberal side of most of these things, I do see the logic behind much of the conservative position, and it's important that we all do, right? That's part of learning about religion in America, is learning what it is that's motivating action on the part of groups of people who are within the context of a nation, right? We're not just learning about religion that happens to take place in America. We're learning about religion in the context and in the frame of a national sphere. So some of that logic is really faith-based, it's theological, like I said, but some of it's social and political, and really at home in the public square. It kind of belongs there, Some of the conservative fears are justified, and they're understandable, regardless of your position. And those are the moments, regardless of where you stand, right? I could do the same thing in the other direction, but those moments where you're like, well, I see where you're coming from. That's the potential for communication across ideological lines. Remember, Interreligious dialogue assumes basic knowledge on both sides of the religious divide that the discussion is designed to bridge. Like, if you have any hope of bridging a discussion, there's lots of talk of unity these days, then you actually do have to know something about what people are thinking on the other side of any perceived divide, right? So interreligious dialogue assumes basic knowledge. So removing the Ten Commandments, does it erase or dismiss or undervalue the nation's shared moral code upon which law depends? Right? That's a real question. It's not a meaningless question, because the rule of law does depend on a shared moral code, shared by at least the majority, requiring enforcement on not too large of a minority. Like, you actually have to buy in. Otherwise, you can't legislate a morality upon the majority unless you just go in for full-blown tyrannical police state, which is an option, I suppose. But the question really is, does the Ten Commandments, do the Ten Commandments effectively represent the nation's shared moral code? Do they, right? For a big enough majority? Like, and if so, then maybe we have a different conversation about whether or not they belong in courthouses. Do they really represent the shared moral code? And the answer seems to be sort of, but like not as well as they did in 1958, for instance. Right? The 1958 was that high watermark of religious affiliation, but today we are at a high watermark of non-affiliation, and maybe it's going to continue to go higher. My crystal ball says it's not. It's going to plateau, but 23.1% of Americans currently choose not to affiliate with any religious organization or institution or community, and that's extraordinarily high for the nation, right? 23.1%. We call them the nuns, as in none of the above, does not affiliate, right? And now there are more nuns in America now than there are Catholics, right? And Catholics have always been the largest single group of religiously affiliated. Anyway, so probably, like, do the Ten Commandments represent a shared moral code? Sort of, but not as well as they did in 1958. So what is the shared moral code? That's a real question. If you're going to try to unify divided people, what really is the functional shared moral code? And some would say that there is none. There's no such thing. America is irredeemably fractured. Humpty Dumpty fell. Stop trying to glue the fragments together like it's going to make a difference, right? Just give it up. It's over. I happen to disagree with that stance. I find it overly cynical. I find it short-sighted. I find it not historically aware. Humpty Dumpty. There is such a thing as American civil religion. It's not unanimously supported, but it does enjoy the approval and participation of the great majority of Americans. There is something that, in fact, the great majority of Americans unify around, right? And it's not without its flaws, including, maybe, an unthinking acceptance of an unconsidered militarism. That's one flaw, potentially. Another one might be an unreflective insularity, buoyed up by an overappreciation of consumer comforts. That might be a flaw. Another flaw might be, a commitment to public pieties and the rituals of nationalism without a corollary sense of commitment to the social practices that those public pieties seem to support. That might be another flaw. Just some ideas. I'm sure that others have other ideas, but this is the picture painted by, this is the picture painted by Bacevich in his Ballpark Liturgy, which you read, right? Here was America's civic religion made manifest, he says, and the bottom left picture is a picture of that game where the Toronto Blue Jays played the Boston Red Sox on the 4th of July to a crowd, sold-out crowd, and an enormous American flag over the storied green monster there, right? But
a monster?
The complacency that Bacevich critiques here really excuse me one second. Hush it. The complacency that Bacevich critiques here undergirds all aspects of the ritualized, militarized nationalism that he describes. Right? That ritualized, militarized nationalism mostly sits on, rests on, lies recumbent upon a great deal of cultural complacency. But that militarized nationalism is, at least in the superficial manner of easy performances and acceptable platitudes, that militarized nationalism is at or very near the core of a nationally shared moral code. Just is, functionally, right? Seems to be. Support of the troops, for instance, is perhaps the only nonpartisan issue in America today, I would suggest to you. And that speaks to a sense of shared meaning, value, and purpose. Like, you know what is sacred to your culture if you find the thing that nobody is allowed to, talk trash about. And imagine a politician today going up and talking any trash about the military. It wouldn't fly. They would be voted out. And so you want to know what's sacred in your culture? Figure out what people aren't allowed to critique. And that's it, right? So if you're interested in this, I do teach an entirely different class on this, so I will move on. Remember, this semester will be about religion in America, right? That we will trace the historical development of a variety of religious, spiritual, traditional communities in the American context. And we will try to maintain a connection to pragmatism, to functional understandings, to life as we actually experience it, to life as we actually live it, right? As humans in America these days. Our goal is to learn about one complex and compelling historical narrative, and by increasing our religious literacy, especially in terms of American history and the religion's relationship to American history, to become, better citizens of a diverse and meaningful world, a world that does construct meaning and live according to it. That's our goal. So following this, you will see I will post a separate lecture specifically picking up these themes on American civil religion as a thing. And we'll begin from there, and then again, next week we will turn to more traditional understandings of religious experience, which I look forward to.